5 furious moves and fights of Khamzat Chimaev. Since Khamzat Chimaev made his electrifying UFC debut in 2020, Burns has wasted little time bulldozing his way into MMA fame. So much so, his meteoric rise has been compared to that of Conor McGregor's. Now, not too many fighters can say that, can they? While it remains to be seen if Chimaev can line his resume with championship, UFC gold, like the former champ McGregor, there's no doubt that lots of folks believe Burns will hoist a UFC belt in the future. But how did Chimaev go about becoming a household name in mixed martial arts? Today we'll dive into some of the most ferocious moves and victories that Chimaev has racked up to date. A man who has smashed 4 of his 6 UFC opponents in the opening round. And we'll take a look at Chimaev's championship prospects at both welterweight and middleweight. So buckle up, folks, because we're about to witness some serious smashing. Khamzat Chimaev ends Ikram Aliskerov with a booming uppercut. Before Chimaev made his way to the octagon in 2002, hardcore fans were already monitoring the career of the Chechnya-born Swedish fighter, especially after Chimaev sent Ikram Aliskerov's consciousness to Jupiter and back in 2019. While Chimaev was already turning heads at that juncture, on account of his amateur wrestling credentials and his 4-0 start in MMA, Aliskerov was also not short on hype. Far from it. After all, Aliskerov is a ridiculously decorated combat sambo fighter who has won 4 world championships in the sport. Further, as he was getting set to face Chimaev at Brave 19, the Dagestani fighter had gone 8-0 to date in MMA. So, there was plenty of clout on the line when Chimaev and Aliskerov squared off. While Aliskerov showcased why he had won so many combat sambo titles early on by defending Chimaev's relentless wrestling pressure, it was the latter who had the last laugh. As the middle of round 1 approached, Burns caught Aliskerov with a booming uppercut, which had him out and then some, before he had even hit the floor. It was a massive victory for Chimaev on account of who he beat, but the victory also showed that he can crack with his right hand. That's something Gerald Meerschaert also found out the hard way. More on that in a minute. Khamzat Chimaev runs through John Phillips and Reese McKee to set new UFC record. One of Chimaev's most memorable victories to date came against John Phillips in 2020, in what was Chimaev's UFC debut. While the win was impressive, what made it so epic was how Chimaev handled himself after and what transpired as a result. Chimaev was booked to fight the rugged middleweight in July 2020, when the UFC was holding cards in the midst of the pandemic on Fight Island. Yeah, remember Fight Island? Burns highlighted his incredible ground game, as many expected would be the case, by taking Phillips down and showcasing a relentless ground and pound attack. So much so, Phillips must have asked why the MMA gods had abandoned him. Finally, in round 2, Chimaev snatched Phillips's neck with a nasty-looking Darcy choke that ended the fight. But as noted, it was how Chimaev carried himself and what he told Dana White afterward, which really buzzed the MMA masses. Immediately after Chimaev had tapped Phillips out, he informed the UFC boss man that he was ready to go, as in, he was ready to fight right away. White was so impressed with what he saw and heard that UFC matchmakers booked Chimaev to fight Reese McKee 10 days later. Similarly to Chimaev, hardcore fans and prospect pundits were more than familiar with McKee at that time, on account of his championship run in Cage Warriors. In fact, McKee was widely considered to be one of the top prospects in the United Kingdom. Not surprisingly, Burns wasn't intimidated in the slightest, and he showed no mercy with McKee as he promptly took the Northern Ireland fighter down and began unleashing fury from above. McKee tried to tough it out, but the smashing was too much, and the fight was called in the opening round. With the win, Chimaev made history, as became the fastest fighter in modern MMA history to win 2 fights. Burns did so just 10 days apart. Khamzat Chimaev quickly puts his booming right to work against Gerald Meerschaert. Following his historical summer on Fight Island, Chimaev was booked to fight Gerald Meerschaert in September 2020. At the time, some believed Meerschaert could be a serious test for Chimaev. After all, while Chimaev had only competed in 8 pro bouts at that juncture, Meerschaert had over 40 on his resume. Further, Meerschaert is a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt, and a pretty respected one at that. So, some questioned whether Chimaev could have some trouble if he took the veteran middleweight down. Well, at the end of the day, none of that mattered. Chimaev needed just 17 seconds to temporarily transport Meerschaert to the Valley of Darkness with a vicious right hook. It was a stunning reminder that Chimaev was and is far from just a wrestling and ground specialist. The dude can bang. Chimaev had already received heaps of praise from Dana White that past summer, but following his win over Meerschaert, the UFC president had this to say about Boers. "The guy's special," White told reporters after the card. "I've been in this game my whole life. I've never seen anything like him. He's special, he's different, and he wants to fight again. I've never been in a position where I'm like, who's next? How do we get him a fight? How do we get him over here? How do we get him over there? How do we do this? How do we do that?" It's fun, and I like it. And I think when you're a fight fan, a guy like this is who you love to watch and follow and hate and whatever it might be. This guy is one of the most special fighters I've ever seen, if not the most special guy that I've ever come across. Khamzat Chimaev sleeps Li Jingliang. While the UFC had massive plans for Chimaev and to get the rising superstar back into the octagon as soon as possible, his title shot run ran into COVID-19. In fact, Boers was hit with the virus so bad, he reported at one juncture that he was done fighting. But as you know, Chimaev ultimately recovered and returned to his smashing ways. In October 2021, he showed no ill effects from the time off or the illness by storming through the always tough Li Jingliang. Chimaev quickly dumped Jingliang on the octagon floor and eventually slept the rugged welterweight with a rear naked choke. Khamzat Chimaev goes to war with Gilbert Burns. On account of his jaw-dropping victories and ever-growing hype train, Chimaev was booked to fight perennial welterweight contender Gilbert Burns in April 2022. Leading up to the fight, there were certainly more than a few people who believed Chimaev would also cruise through Burns. After all, Boers had only been hit twice in his 4 UFC bouts to date. Think about that for a second. That said, there were others who knew that Burns was going to be a stiff test for Chimaev, as a result of his ever-improving striking, heavy hands, and world-class ground game. The people who predicted that outcome turned out to be right. While Chimaev ultimately won the thrilling war via unanimous decision, he ate plenty of hard shots during the fight. In fact, Burns outstruck the smashing machine by a 141-124 margin. But at the end of the day, the bout showed that Chimaev could hang with and defeat one of the best welterweights in the game. And as a result, talk about him fighting for the welterweight title spiked to new levels. Will Khamzat Chimaev fight Kamaru Usman next and hoist UFC gold in the future? As we head into the latter half of 2023, it will be interesting to see what comes next for Chimaev. While some believe he could and should fight for a belt now, it doesn't seem like that's in the cards yet. Especially since Chimaev spoiled a planned bout with Nate Diaz in September 2022 by coming in way overweight for the welterweight contest. Chimaev proceeded to impress by running through replacement opponent Kevin Holland, but his inability to make 170 pounds for the Diaz fight has left many wondering if a welterweight title run is feasible at this juncture. At one point, there was plenty of talk about Chimaev and Kamaru Usman throwing hands, when the latter was the UFC's welterweight champ. While talk about the two fighting has spiked again, it doesn't look like it will be at 170 pounds. During a recent appearance on the Jim Rome show, White had this to say about the possibility of Usman and Chimaev locking horns.
What I hate about that fight and calling him out, Usman's calling him out, but at a catch weight. I don't do catch weights. I don't like catch weights. Catch weights mean nothing. They mean absolutely nothing. If he wants to move up to 185 and fight him, we can talk about it. But trying to fight him at a catch weight, I'm not interested in.
So, there you have it. Do you think this fight will get booked at 185 pounds? And if so, how will it look? There's no doubt that Usman would be the best fighter to date that Chimaev has faced. After all, we're talking about one of the greatest welterweights of all time, who has outstanding boxing, fantastic wrestling, and cardio for days. But how will Usman look at 185 pounds? Will his speed and power be as evident? Against a man who has demonstrated, quite violently, that he can perform just fine at middleweight. All that said, the timing seems right for the UFC to book this fight. Usman is coming off consecutive losses to the new welterweight king Leon Edwards, and Chimaev is in need of another big-name opponent. Usman fits that bill, and then some. If Chimaev can defeat the renowned fighter, then his case for a title shot will become that much stronger. In fact, if Chimaev records an emphatic win over Usman, don't be surprised if he's tapped for a shot at middleweight gold. That title shot could mean that Chimaev battles Israel Adesanya, and that would be another massive fight for the UFC. In fact, it has the makings of one of the biggest bouts in UFC history. Adesanya has handed noted wrestlers like Yoel Romero and Derek Brunson defeats during his historical UFC run. But Romero didn't lean on his wrestling, and Brunson typically doesn't chain his takedown attempts in the same relentless fashion as Chimaev. Further, Izzy did have issues with John Blachowicz' wrestling and top game, although that fight was at light heavyweight. So if Adesanya versus Chimaev does happen, it will be really interesting to see whether the latter can end Izzy's reign as champion. But what do you think? Will Chimaev get past Usman, or will Usman hand Chimaev his first defeat? And if Boers ends up facing the last style bender, which massive star will have their hand raised? Let us know in the comments section below, and if you like this video, be sure to like it and to subscribe to KO Central MMA.